American dude Allen loaded into a Chinese fantasy server, fog sealed the broken mountains at the edge of the southern wilds before the shattered gate of Moonfall Sect. The grand elder Taoist Qingsong led the last 30 disciples. Kneeling in mud, their faces were drained of color like men already dead. Today was the final deadline from Tiger Roar Sect. If they could not hand over 100 top-grade spirit stones, Moonfall Sect would be wiped out before Sunset Taoist Qingsong lifted his head to the sky and let out a helpless sigh. He cursed only that the founding patriarch had ascended without leaving a single word. He had abandoned his descendants to be trampled in the middle of that bleak despair. The thick fog at the mountain gate suddenly boiled a ragged figure, stumbled out of it. There was no ripple of spiritual power at all. Yet he had passed straight through the protective maze formation that even great nascent soul experts could not see through. He appeared right in front of everyone, like a knife-cutting cloth. The newcomer was Alan, a veteran backpacker from California. He looked wrecked beyond belief. His expensive shell jacket had been torn into strips. By thorns he gripped a snapped trekking pole in his hand. His face was full of fear and exhaustion from being lost for 3 days. But in Taoist Qingsong eyes, everything tasted different. Alan had no spiritual aura leaking out. To Qingsong, that meant a supreme realm where power returned to plainness. Alan's strange bright clothes looked broken yet still carried the shine of some unknown high-grade material. Even the broken wooden pole in his hand seemed to match the idea of the great Tao being incomplete. Alan stared at the crowd of people in ancient robes kneeling in the mud. His stomach turned cold. His mind screamed that this was a nightmare film set. He took a step back, ready to run. He mumbled in English that he was sorry, and this was the wrong place. Those strange sounds hit Taoist Qingsong ears like a great bell. It was not the language of the 9 provinces, yet it carried a rhythm that felt ancient and heavy. It sounded like lost true words of the Tao from a forgotten era. Taoist Qingsong whole body shook. His mind completed the story on its own. This must be a hidden supreme ancestor returning from the void. Because the sect was in danger, that true word must be scolding the useless descendants for letting the sect fall so low. Qingsong's eyes filled with tears. He slammed his forehead to the ground and shouted to welcome the ancestor out of seclusion. The disciples behind him followed at once. They bowed until their foreheads hit mud. Their voices shook the valley. Alan legs went weak from terror. He tried to explain. He could not find a single sentence that would help. A wild howl rose from the mountain road below. Zhao Taiju, an outer sect enforcer from Tiger Roar Sect, stormed up with a pack of thugs. He carried a ghost head saber that flashed with cold light. He opened his mouth and demanded lives. Alan had never seen real blades like this. His brain went blank. He froze. Where he stood, fear locked his face so hard it became numb. He stared at Zhao Taiju only because he was too afraid to blink. He thought if he closed his eyes, his head would fall from his neck. In Zhao Taiju's eyes, that expression became a bottomless death stare. He had expected Moonfall Sect to be lambs on the chopping block. Instead, a strange man appeared out of nowhere. This man faced a saber without even lifting an eyelid. He had no killing aura at all, yet his stillness made the air feel wrong cold. Sweat poured down Zhao Taiju's forehead. Zhao Taiju shouted a few threats. To test him, the strange man kept looking at him like he was an ant. Not a word came out of him. Alan finally regained a little control of his body. His hand trembled. As he lifted it, he held his palm outward and waved it weakly. He meant, no, no, I cannot, and please do not come closer. But Zhao Taiju saw something else. That casual wave looked like a supreme expert dismissing dust. It felt like a warning that one finger could turn him to ash. The pressure in his mind shattered. Zhao Taiju screamed. He spun and rolled and crawled down the mountain road, dragging his men with him. Alan watched the armed thugs flee. For no reason his knees buckled. He almost dropped into the mud. Behind him, the people of Moonfall Sect were already bowing until their bodies were flat. They believed the Ancestor had released heaven. Shaking might they believed he had forced the enemy back with nothing but presence. The last light of the sinking sun bled through the broken lattice windows and painted the blue stone floor old sandalwood. Incense mixed with the sour stink of rotten timber and pressed down on the breath deep in the hall. A single candle shook in the draught and stretched one anxious shadow long, then short, then long again. Alan paced back and forth in the center like a man who lost his map and his mind. At the same time, his expensive hiking boots thudded in messy, uneven beats through the silent space. His brows stayed knotted tight. His eyes kept darting his head, was nothing but escape routes and worst-case timing. With every step, he measured the odds of slipping down the mountain without being caught in the corner. Several elders watched him, without moving their faces, were wet with awe not fear to them. This was not panic, this was depth. Grand Elder Chingsong lowered his voice and spoke with trembling reverence to the disciples. Beside him, he said the Ancestor was using footwork to measure the broken chi flow of heaven and earth. He said the furrowed brow was grief for the sect fate. Falling into ruin, he said such a heart was too vast for them to understand. Just as their self-moved devotion reached its peak, the hall outside exploded with shrill cries and running feet. Two disciples, soaked in blood, crashed through the door and nearly fell as they carried a stretcher. On the stretcher lay Yifan, the once-in-a-century genius of the sect. His face was purple-black, like bruised eggplant. White foam bubbled at his lips. His arms and legs twitched without control. His breath was thin like a thread, ready to snap. Chingsong lunged forward. He touched two fingers to the pulse, and his world collapsed. He slumped to the floor, and his voice broke into a hoarse wail. He said it was 5-step soul-breaking powder. He said the poison had already reached the heart. He said even a true immortal could not save him. Despair flooded the hall like black water. Then every head turned at once, every pair of eyes locked onto Alan, who was trying to crawl under the offering table in the confusion. The elders dropped to their knees together, foreheads struck stone again and again until the sound filled the hall. They begged the Ancestor to use heaven-reaching methods and save this last sprout. Alan stared at the dying kid on the stretcher, cold sweat soaked through the fabric against his spine. Inside his head, he screamed that he was just a backpacker, and he did not know any poison cure. He saw swords at their waists. He knew if he said no, he might be chopped into pieces before he finished the word fear, and the will to live drove his hands into his pack. His fingers found the side pocket and touched the only liquid he had left, half a bottle of leftover mineral water. It was all he had. It was the only thing on his body that even looked like it could help. He forced his face to stay calm. He pulled out the clear plastic bottle. In the eyes of everyone watching, it became a flawless crystal treasure. From legends, the liquid inside looked too pure to be mortal. The air seemed to brighten around it. He twisted the cap off and crouched beside Ye Fan. His hand shook so hard he could barely aim the bottle mouth. He was not enlightened. He was terrified. His whole arm trembled like it was running on pure panic. Chingsong saw the shaking and his pupils shrank in shock. In his mind, this was no common tremble. This was the lost thunder shaking, transforming Chi hand. The Ancestor was using high-frequency vibration to break the violent medicine force into a form the mortal body could endure. Alan knew none of that. He only tipped the bottle and tried to pour water into Yi Fan's mouth without choking him. His teeth clenched so hard, his jaw ached. His breath came in broken steam. Raps. He kept praying in silence that the kid would not die right here. He kept praying that this awful, stupid gamble would not turn him into a murderer in front of a hall full of armed strangers. The candlelight stayed thin and weak. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted like restless spirits. The stink of blood still hung in the air and only grew heavier in the silence. Every eye in the hall stayed nailed to the clear bottle, like it was the last hope left in the world. As the water slid past Yi Fan blue-purple lips, Alan watched for any sign at all. Yi Fan did not move. Alan felt his heartbeat climb into his throat. He was already imagining a sword coming down for what he had done. Then Yi Fan body suddenly seized hard. He arched once, like lightning hit him. He opened his mouth and spilled a mouthful of rancid black blood onto the floor. Alan flinched so hard he almost dropped the bottle. The black blood sizzled as it hit the stone. It ate into the green brick like acid at the same time. Color rushed back into Yi Fan's face. The dead gray drained away, warmth returned to his skin right before everyone could see it happen. A clean, fierce current of spiritual energy rose from him. For the first time in his life, Grand Elder Qingsong began to tremble all over. He pointed at the plain plastic bottle like he was staring at a miracle. He shouted that this was the legendary rootless divine water that could cleanse marrow and forge bone. He shouted that it did not just break the poison, it shattered the shackles that had trapped Yi Fan for years. Yi Fan rolled over and dropped to his knees. His eyes were wet, his chest heaved with sobbing breaths. The elders followed him down. Tears ran down their faces as they cried out that the Ancestor was merciful. Alan felt like he was sitting on needles. Their worship made his skin crawl. All he wanted was to calm them down and find a way to slip out alive. But the crowd only grew louder. They begged for guidance. They begged for the true path. They begged him to pass down a supreme teaching. Alan backed up until there was nowhere left to go. His mind went blank. Then one useless memory floated up from a college gym class he took for an easy credit. He had learned a few motions by rote and forgotten them. The moment the semester ended, now that scrap of muscle memory was all he had, he gave a helpless sigh. He thought if he was going to die anyway, he might as well bluff with something. He lifted his arms. Stiffly, he bent his knees. A little he tried to copy the opening posture of Tai Chi as best as he could remember. His movement was slow and awkward. His hands traced a crooked arc through the air. Without thinking, he muttered the words wild horse parts, its mane to Alan. It felt painfully embarrassing to the disciples. It looked like the simplest form hiding the deepest lore. Qingsong. Pupils shook in his eyes. The Ancestor hands were cradling heaven and earth. The motion was not slow because it was weak. It was slow because the weight of the rules of the world was too heavy to move quickly. In that moment, slow became fast, and plain became terrifying. Alan tried to cover his embarrassment by switching to something even simpler. He did a chest expansion move from old broadcast calisthenics. He threw his arms wide in one sharp open and closed. His joints cracked from tension and stiffness. The hall went dead. Quiet. Not a single disciple dared to breathe in their minds. That open and close held the grandeur of splitting the sky and holding the sun and moon. The cracking sound was not bone. It was space itself crying under pressure. All through the hall they stared with hungry reverence. They memorized every shift of his shoulders, every tremble in his fingers, every careless detail. They feared that if they blinked, they would miss the key to a method that could shake an era. As Alan finished the final pose of that not quite proper chest expansion, moved the air in the great hall, seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Yi Fan, who had just been saved from poison, suddenly felt a spark of instinct. He clumsily copied the way the Ancestor opened and closed his arms. Crackling sounds burst from inside his body. Meridians that had been blocked and sluggish suddenly opened in that instant. A warm current ran up his spine like a rising tide. It rushed straight to the crown of his head. Yi Fan stared at his own hands in disbelief. Excitement shook him so hard his whole body trembled. He could not believe a motion that looked almost silly could contain a supreme method. He could not believe that copying the shape alone could shake a cultivation bottleneck. When the disciples saw it, their reverence for Alan surged to the peak. But Alan, standing above them, felt darkness creeping into his vision. It was not enlightenment. He was simply starving before he entered the mountains. He had only eaten one energy bar after the terror and chaos. His blood sugar had dropped to nothing. His legs went soft. He followed the weakness and collapsed onto a cushion. In the eyes of everyone watching, it became the Ancestor finishing the teaching and entering calm stillness. His pale face and cold sweat became a sign of the Tao void after the spirit traveled beyond the body. The elders held their breath and did not dare disturb his quiet cultivation. Then a dull, long sound suddenly exploded through the hall. Alan's stomach stomach, growled loud enough to echo the sound, rolled through the empty space. Like thunder behind clouds, Alan felt so embarrassed he wanted to vanish into the floor because it was nothing but hunger crying from his gut. But Grand Elder Chingsong turned deathly pale. He snapped his head up and stared at the place below Alan's ribs. Shock filled his eyes to him. This was not hunger. It was the legendary Dao Thunder sound that only a body saint could cultivate. The ancestor was using the organs to manifest thunder. He was shaking heaven and earth from within. That realm sounded terrifying. Beyond belief, Alan felt a cramp twist his stomach. He could not hold on anymore. He lifted his eyelids. With effort, he pushed out a weak English word food. When everyone looked confused, he pointed at his mouth. He tried to shape the meaning with a fading voice, something to eat. Chingsong looked as if lightning had struck his soul shame, flooded his face until it turned bright red. He slapped his own thigh hard. He sent a message to the elders and scolded them in grief. He blamed them for forgetting that the ancestor might be boundless in cultivation. Yet this body had just returned to plainness. After using a heaven-defying divine fist, the consumption would be immense. The ancestor was not hungry in any ordinary way. The flesh body urgently needed high-tier spiritual materials to fill the loss. When Chingsong thought of the sect having only common grains, he felt a deep humiliation. He felt that offering such things would be an insult to the ancestor. A servant disciple moved to bring steamed buns. Chingsong stopped him at once and shouted him down. Then Chingsong led the elders in a heavy bow toward Alan. They swore they would find Millennium Spirit medicine to present in tribute. As soon as the vow left their mouths, they rushed out of the hall in a storm to search the storehouse. Alan reached out in despair. His hand froze in midair. He watched them disappear to chase those so-called heavenly treasures. He was left alone in the empty great hall. So hungry the golden stars burst in his vision. Grand Elder Chingsong returned with a face as solemn as a pilgrim. At a shrine, he bowed with full respect and asked Alan to follow him. He guided Alan through ruined corridors that smelled of rot and incense. They headed toward the forbidden back mountain. Or so hungry, his head spun and his sight pulsed. He assumed the path to the dining hall was simply long and inconvenient, so he trudged after them on numb legs like a sleepwalker. But the farther they went, the more lonely. The path became dead yellow grass, brushed their ankles. Cold wind hissed through bare branches. Alan felt uneasy and confused. He wondered what kind of food could exist out here in the wilderness. He wondered if they planned to hunt something or dig wild greens. At last, they stopped beside a dried-up cold pond. In the cracked basin lay a giant turtle, as large as a small house. Its shell was webbed. With deep fractures, its breath was weak, and ragged. Its cloudy eyes were dull with the gray of dying. Chingsong looked stricken with grief. He said this was the sect guardian beast, and its lifespan was at the end. He had brought Alan here to confess the sect shame. He had wanted to admit they were so useless. They could not even feed the guardian beast. But when Alan saw it, he stopped without taking another step. In Alan's eyes, this was not some divine guardian. It was simply an old turtle dying alone. That hopeless cloudy stare pierced him. It reminded him of himself, lost in a strange land, unable to speak the language, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. A heavy shared loneliness rose in his chest. Alan let out a slow breath. The hunger clawing at his gut fell quiet for a moment. Under a sudden wave of pity, he walked up to the turtle. He knelt down without caring about moss and grime. He reached out and gently stroked the rough, wrinkled head. The turtle seemed to feel the warmth of his palm. It gave a low, strained sound from deep in its throat. It nudged his hand with a tired motion, as if asking to be comforted. Alan felt his throat tighten. Without thinking, he began to hum a lullaby from home. It was the melody his mother used to sing when he was small rock-a-bye baby on the treetop. The soft, slightly hoarse English tune drifted through the empty valley. For Chingsong and the elders, the structure of that music had never existed in the cultivation world. To them, it was the most obscure and profound ancient ancient soul-soothing chant. They watched in fear and reverence. As the death aura around the turtle began to fade, it melted away, like frost under sunlight. The turtle, painful wheezing, eased little by little. Its cloudy eyes slowly cleared into something gentle. Its whole presence changed from dread into quiet release. It no longer looked like a creature afraid of dying. It looked like a child slipping into sleep in a mother's arms. When the last note faded, the turtle slowly closed its eyes. A faint trace of a smile seemed to rest on its mouth. In the next breath, its massive body did not rot and collapse. It broke apart into countless sparkling golden points of light. The lights did not scatter and vanish. They sank into the cracked earth like warm rain. The ground trembled and the mountain responded. But the shaking carried no danger. Dead wood pushed out green buds. Cold water surged up and filled the pond again. Tender spirit grass rose from barren soil right before their eyes. The thin spiritual energy in the air thickened and swelled as if it had been set free. A sect spirit vein that had been exhausted for years reconnected and revived inside the mountain. The elders stood frozen under the falling golden light. They stared at Alan, standing there in silence. To them, his back looked taller than heaven and earth. They believed he had transcended a soul. With a single song, they believed he had brought spring back to a dying mountain. With one gentle act, the revival of the sect's spirit vein in the back mountain brought sudden life to the barren land. But it also left Alan with no cultivation to protect him. He had stood too long in the cold wind. By the frozen pond, he caught a heavy cold, for real now. He lay slumped in the grand hall in the chair that once belonged to the sect master. He wrapped his torn shell jacket tight around himself. His nose was bright red. His eyes were watery and sore each time an itch rose inside his nostrils. He fought it with everything he had. He wanted to keep the image of an expert who never loses composure, so he forced the sneeze back down. His whole body would shiver in strange sudden bursts. To Qingsong and the disciples watching below, those shivers became proof of something sacred. They believed the ancestor spirit had left the body. They believed he was resonating with the great Tao of heaven and earth. They believed each tremor was him drawing heavenly chi to wash and refine the flesh. At the same time, the eruption of spiritual energy from Moonfall Mountain spread like a lighthouse flare. In the night, it instantly alerted Tiger Roar Sect. 30 li away, Tiger Roar Sect Master Hu Meng was a huge man with a face full of hard muscle and greed. When his scouts reported that the dying Moonfall Sect now surged with sky high, his eyes lit up. But Hu Meng was cautious by nature. He remembered the report that their outer deacon had been scared off by a supposed great expert who returned to plainest doubt gnawed at him. So he decided to gather the sect elites and lead them himself. He called it a formal visit to the mountain. In truth, it was a probe. If the ancestor was real, they would kneel and beg for an opportunity. If it was a trick, then today would be the day. Moonfall Sect was erased inside the grand hall. The air turned heavy. Qingsong sensed the killing intent approaching from far away. He fell to his knees in front of Alan and begged for guidance on how to face the enemy. Alan was burning with fever and could not understand a word. All he felt was his belly twisting with cramps. He urgently needed to find a bathroom. He weakly lifted his hand and pointed toward the hidden latrine in the corner of a side hall. He tried to signal that he had to go. Qingsong froze in confusion. Alan shook his head in helpless frustration, as if to say, "Do not block me. I cannot hold on." Qingsong followed the direction of that finger. It was the lowest dead corner of the sect grounds. A wild spark of realization flashed in his eyes. He spun around and spoke in a low, fierce voice to the disciples. He said, "The ancestor intended to place them in death and then bring them to life. He said that dead corner was the only life gate of the mountain guarding array. He said it was also the best trap to lure the enemy deep inside." As for the ancestor shaking his head, Qingsong declared it was a signal that there was no need for a grand battle. They only needed to set an ambush there and capture the leader in one strike. The disciples' blood surged. They grabbed shovels and talismans and rushed toward the latrine to set formations. Alan saw the crowd finally clear out of his way. He could not endure another second. He let out a thunderous sneeze. Then his whole body went limp. He collapsed and fell into sleep to the elders who stayed behind it became something else entirely. They believed the Ancestor had just finished spirit. Roaming through the void, they believed he was now using the turtle breathing method to store energy. They believed he was waiting to deliver a thunderbolt strike to the invaders. Black clouds hung low, like a lid over the mountain gate. Tiger Roar Sect banners snapped in the gale. Hundreds of cultivators sealed off Moonfall Sect until there was no gap to breathe through. Sect Master Hu Meng hovered in the air as if he were walking on nothing. A ghost head saber carried him beneath his feet. He looked down on the broken survivors, like a butcher judging scraps. To test what was real, Hu Meng snorted. Coldly, he released the full terror of a mid-stage Golden Core realm, Aura. In an instant, the sky seemed to dim and invisible pressure crashed down like a mountain collapsing onto the square for Moonfall Sect. People whose highest strength barely reached foundation establishment. This was disaster. Bodies dropped to the ground one after another, Chingsong, and the disciples went paper white. Their knees trembled and tried to fold. They forced every shred of spiritual power out to resist, even so they could only hold themselves on one knee. Blood leaked from the corners of their mouths. Internal injuries spread through them like fire, yet Alan, at the center, looked like an unnatural exception. Two disciples had propped him at the front. Earlier he was already feverish, and half awake he swayed on his feet, not from fear, only from weakness, caused by a brutal cold. When Hu Meng pressure poured down, the spiritual energy around them seemed to freeze. But to Alan, who had no spirit roots at all, it felt like nothing more than a stronger draft blowing through a hallway. A mortal has no spiritual sense, so the so-called soul-crushing pressure could not even reach him. To Alan, the stuffed nose was more miserable than anything in the air. The gale kicked sand and grit off the ground, and into Alan's eyes he sniffed through the blockage. He forced his heavy eyelids open. Annoyance flashed across his face. He lifted a hand and waved in front of him to brush away the flying dirt. Then he tugged his leaky windbreaker tighter around his body. That simple motion hit Hu Meng like a hammer. Hu Meng watched his golden core pressure crush Moonfall Sect until they spat blood, yet the so-called Ancestor in strange clothes did not move at all. Not only did the man stand straight, he even waved his hand like he was shooing a fly in the middle of a violent spiritual storm. Hu Meng pupils shrank. Hard cold sweat burst across his forehead. In his mind, that casual wave meant his golden core power was nothing. It meant the man could stir heaven and earth like playing with dust. No one could ignore full pressure like this without even lighting protective radiance. That depth could only belong to a legend of returning to plainness. Hu Meng arrogance died on the spot. Even the ghost head saber beneath his feet began to tremble uncontrollably. Murderous chill circled the sect gate, and the air thickened like lead dark clouds, swallowed the sunset, and only a few weak strands of light fell on tense faces. Hu Meng stared at Moonfall Sect and decided to probe the strange man with one strike. He raised his ghost head saber high and poured power into it without restraint. A black blade arc 3. Zhang Long tore out with a sound like wailing ghosts. It flew straight for the man in the strange windbreaker. Alan was already dizzy from a brutal cold, and his head burned with fever. Now he saw that terrifying black light coming down on him, and the last thread of reason snapped. Fear and weakness hit at the same time, and his body betrayed him. His knees went soft, and he dropped like wet cloth onto the ground. His legs folded into a twisted knot. His hands braced on his knees by instinct as he tried to keep from tipping over. The pose was awkward and miserable, but in Hu Meng's eyes it was thunder splitting the sky. The blade arc stopped dead 3 inches above Alan's head. As if nailed by invisible law, Hu Meng's pupils shrank and a storm rose in his heart. He believed this was a terrifying earth vein trap. He believed If his strike landed, the earth chi would rebound tenfold or 100-fold, and tear him apart. Allen's eyes were lowered, and his face showed nothing that calm under a collapsing mountain made Hugh Meng certain this was a killing snare. The ancestor was holding the central palace steady like a stone. If they did not strike, now they would never strike. Qingsong's eyes flashed, and he shouted for the Taiji divine fist formation. The disciples moved at once and rushed to circle Allen. Where he sat, they formed an array around him, as if guarding a sacred core. First came the arm swing movement. Dozens of arms opened and closed in sharp rhythm. The motion pulled in the surrounding spiritual energy and built a vast repelling force. Then came the kicking movement. Dozens of leg shadows of spiritual power wove into a net. They slammed into the Tiger Roar Sect cultivators, who were already panicking and trying to retreat. This joint formation, born from broadcast calisthenics, erupted with absurd strength. With Allen unknowingly sitting at the eye of the storm, the power multiplied beyond belief. Allen sat in the center and only heard screams and crashing feet around him. To him, it felt like he had fallen into the middle of a riot. Tiger Roar Sect was beaten into a total rout. Hugh Meng was struck in the chest by a wave of power flung from the collective torso twist movement. He spat a mouthful of blood and screamed as he fled in a streak of light. He did not even dare leave a single harsh word behind. Bonfires lit up the square before Moonfall Sect Great Hall, a celebration of surviving the disaster, set the night on fire. Fruit wine and roasted meat mixed together, and for a while, even the battlefield blood smell was buried. Allen sat in the center, like the moon with stars circling him. After a few cups of high-proof spirit, fruit wine, the tension that had held him all day finally snapped. Alcohol washed the last of his reason clean away. He wobbled to his feet with a flushed face. He waved at Taoist Qingsong, who stared at him with worship. He slurred in English mixed with clumsy Chinese that he could not do this. He said no God. He said he was just a normal person. He said an ordinary person. He asked if they understood. Taoist Qingsong heard those words, and his eyes instantly turned wet. He turned to the disciples and spoke with deep feeling. He said, the ancestor was using this body to teach the Tao. He said the great Tao was simple. He said even if cultivation reached the sky, the heart still had to return to the ordinary world. He said that was the final meaning of returning to plainness. The disciples listened like they were drunk on scripture. They nodded. Again and again they watched Allen stumble and sway as if they were watching a true Buddha playing in the mortal world. Their eyes burned with fanatical admiration. But in the shadows, a Tiger Roar Sect formation, Master sat tied up with thick ropes. His gaze never left Allen. All day long, he had not felt even a thread of spiritual power moving through Allen's body. At first, he told himself it was because the man was too deep to be measured. But now Allen's feet were unsteady. His steps had no method at all. His eyes were dull from drink. A wild idea detonated in the formation master's mind. He waited until the guarding disciples raised their cups and shouted with joy. Then he tore free from the ropes that had never been reinforced with spiritual power. He grabbed a plain iron meat-cutting dagger from the table. He lunged at Allen like a starving wolf. Only the nearest junior disciple managed to cry out a warning, but it was already too late. There was no protective light. There was no golden radiance. There was not even a basic dodge. The rusty plain iron dagger sliced through Allen's expensive windbreaker with no resistance. It cut deep into his left arm. A thin tearing sound rang out. Bright hot blood burst free. At once Allen froze for a split second. Then pain drilled straight into his bones. His eyes went wide. His face twisted hard. He let out a scream full of raw mortal terror. He shouted that he was bleeding. He shouted for help. His voice was sharp and ugly and desperate. It ripped the sacred filter apart. In one breath, the victory feast fell into instant silence. Even the crackle of the bonfires became painfully clear. Everyone stood rigid. They stared at the bright red drops sliding down Allen's arm and splashing into the dust. It was not golden immortal. Blood it carried no Tao law at all. It was the most ordinary human blood with a sharp iron smell. The formation master held up the bloody dagger and laughed like a madman into the dead night. He shouted that Alan was a mortal. He shouted there was no ancestor at all. He shouted that Alan was nothing but a mortal. The mad laughter hit the night like a sledgehammer. In that instant, the dream Moonfall Sect had clung to shattered into dust. The other Tiger Roar captives snapped from fear into our age and shame. If there was no peerless ancestor, then the man bleeding on the ground was just meat. Several of them roared as they tore through their ropes. Spirit light flared around their bodies as they lunged in with twisted faces. Alan clutched his bleeding arm and shook so hard his teeth wanted to chatter. Cold pain flooded him and made his vision swim. He saw blades and killing light rushing straight for his throat. He shut his eyes and waited for the end. With nothing left inside his head, a sharp ring of steel split the air. The death he expected never arrived. Alan opened his eyes in a trembling slit. The senior disciple, who always acted meek, was in front of him. With a sword raised, blood ran from the disciple's palm, where the hilt had torn his grip. Yet he did not back away, even a step. He forced the formation master strike aside with raw stubborn will. Then Yi fanned the boy Alan had saved with a plastic bottle through his arms wide. He planted himself in front of Alan like a thin wall of flesh. His narrow shoulders trembled under the pressure, but his feet did not move. The Tiger Roar formation master shouted at them in disbelief, "You will die for a liar with no cultivation." The senior disciple bared his teeth and drove the enemy back with a desperate slash. "He is not a liar. He gave Moonfall Sect the dignity we lost long ago." Yifan shouted too with red eyes and a cracked voice. "Whether he is God or man, he saved my life. He taught us to stand up straight." That cry struck the crowd like thunder. The stunned disciples around them jolted awake. They finally understood what had really changed these past days. Their progress and their unity did not come from fantasies of divine power. It came from a mortal who had dragged their courage back into the light. "Protect Elder Allen," someone yelled first. The hesitation in every face burned away. In its place rose a fierce hunger they had never owned before. They stopped begging for invisible protection. They drew their swords and charged. They fought for the man who taught them strange exercises. They fought for the man who told them stories from a faraway world. Angry blades surged like a tide and swallowed the Tiger Roar. Remnants, the cowards of yesterday, exploded into warriors. Humiliation and fury became sharp, clean sword light. In moments, the riot was crushed into silence. When it was over, Alan was wrapped in bandages until he looked like a bundled doll. He crouched in a corner and stared at the ground, afraid the reckoning would come. Taoist Ching Song led the disciples into neat lines this time. No one threw themselves down like worshippers. They bowed to Alan with solemn respect. Their eyes no longer looked at a god, they looked at an elder worth honoring. From that day on, Moonfall Sect gained a special guest elder. He did not cultivate. He did not know spells. He only lay in a custom chair. In the sun, he taught a few odd English words. He told fairy tales from the world he missed in one ruthless corner of the cultivation realm. Alan finally let the mask fall. As a mortal, he lived the quiet retirement he had never dared to dream of, and the whole sect fed him as if that were the most natural thing in the world.